Welcome to this video on the Levi-Civita connection,
Christ.
named after a French mathematician.
You're a piece of work, my friend. Ain't a bad idea. Let's get him the f*** out of here.
It looks at the Levi-Civita
Tullio Levi-Civita. Tullio Levi-Civita. Before I go into reading about Levi-Civita, this whole connection of Levi-Civita stuff came in about 1917, which Einstein's field equations were fully baked in 1915. Einstein's Annus Memorabilis was 1905, which had the four papers. There was special relativity, the photoelectric effect, Brownian motion, one other thing which is on the tip of my tongue, but I'm forgetting right now. But so, like, if you just opened up this math differential geometry book to a random page and you happened to open up to page 232, 233, it might look like a normal book. And I'm gonna get some fruit cracked open here. Salut tout le monde. Welcome back to another differential geometry reading stream. I'm Anthony, obviously, and in these reading stream episodes, this is not a lecture, this is not a course, this is not a podcast, this is not necessarily an audiobook. Now, I will say, in a lot of the beginnings of those intros, those like canned, you could call them like a YouTuber intro or whatever, I always say, obviously, or in a lot of them I'll say, I'm Anthony, obviously. And that's a good place to start today's episode. So, up to this point, I've been reading Differential Geometry by Erwin Kreisig out loud for you guys, also putting the text on screen. And I have a tendency to also do these rants, these rambles, these kind of like offshoots, tangents, going down rabbit holes. A lot having to do with general relativity, because that's obviously a subject area that's really closely related to differential geometry. Lately, I've also been kind of going over the distinction between differential geometry, smooth manifold theory, and then what might be more properly known as Riemannian geometry. Because here we are in chapter 7, called Absolute Differentiation and Displacement. We've gotten into these topics like the Ricci identity, the Bianchi identities, looking at what even kicked off Riemannian geometry in the first place, right? Filling in the gaps of über die Hypothesen, welche der Geometrie, whatever, I don't speak German, but Riemann's whole thesis that kicked off Riemannian geometry, filling in the gaps. So now here we are in section 76, which is on the definition of the displacement of Levi-Civita in differential geometry. And this book right here that I have in my hands was technically published by republished, or I guess maybe not published, but it's a reprinting of a book that was originally published in like 1959. So I've gone over this in the last several episodes, but Erwin Kreisig wrote this book, published it in 1959 or so. 2008 Dover reprints it, but what's relevant here is that about 10 years later, in like 1969, there were a lot of mathematicians or people who read that 1959 print, which is what I have here, which was reprinted in 2008. But a lot of people had a lot of the same criticisms of this book, basically, that I've run into. Things like, oh, why is the dimension 3? If you're doing general relativity, why wouldn't you be using the dimension of 4 for space-time? The way that metrics are treated in this, weird. The way Riemannian manifolds are treated in this, as opposed to how it treats surfaces instead, weird. And then getting to these chapters, or not chapters, this chapter on absolute differentiation, all this Riemannian geometry stuff, the way it was handled, weird. So basically, Erwin Kreisig, 10 years after, so like after 1959, the contents of this book are published. That book from 1959, it actually went out of print. So 10 years later, 9 years later, Kreisig goes back and he's like, I'm going to come out with a new book called Intro to Differential Geometry and Riemannian Geometry, which I mentioned in the last video or so. And basically he addresses a lot of those criticisms. So there's a lot of sections were, you know, put into different chapters so that just like the layout of the material is more clear. But then there are also additional sections on Riemannian manifolds specifically, and then, you know, going a little bit deeper into things like submanifolds and blah, 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 theorems related things like that, okay? With that, he went back and he obviously used the same material from that 1959 edition, and then he rewrote it and then he made it better. But this is the thing, I don't mean to put on the whole tinfoil conspiracy hat, but okay, this is differential geometry, very related to general relativity. And so a few things happened. One, this book is dedicated to Stefan Bergman. And as I've come to realize, Stefan Bergman is one of the mathematicians, the big names in math at the time of World War II, where he was around in Germany, Poland, all this stuff. Stefan Bergman is Jewish, okay? That comes with all the political ramifications. So Stefan Bergman moves to America, World War II, Germans lose, all this kind of stuff. And maybe there was some, you know, secret stuff going on related to general relativity, okay? But that was maybe all, you know, kept in black programs, okay? But then Stefan Bergman, he dies in 1972 now. And the 1959 book of differential geometry goes out of print. Kreisig, he goes back 69, he writes Intro to Differential Geometry and Riemannian Geometry. It's a better book, but then, okay, Stefan Bergman dies in 1972, and then maybe they're like, you know, in universities and academia, they're starting to go away from general relativity, because it's like that stuff is starting to get sucked into those black programs that I was talking about, you know, in aerospace and government with the whole classification of stuff, developments in areas of differential geometry related to general relativity, related to whatever secret technologies they're working on, it gets swept away under, let's say, like copyright and trademark, you know, stuff. So that's how it goes secret, basically. You know, Stefan Bergman dies, and Erwin Kreisig's differential geometry books, they don't take off. What does take off maybe are like his, you know, advanced engineering mathematics textbooks and all that. Also, I just want to say that like Erwin Kreisig is kind of like, he kind of seems like a dying breed of math professors. Like he would just kind of work on all these different cool, zany projects, and he would just kind of, everything that he sees is all about math. He's got the math curse. Everything that he sees and touches turns into math. And that's just kind of like the professor that he was. And then like, just at the way, you know, like funding and stuff with universities were at the time, he could just like hop between different universities and just be like doing his math thing all the time. That really doesn't exist anymore, right? And I would say, like, not to be conspiratorial, okay, now stepping out of the tinfoil hat world, after the 70s and, you know, general relativity had like a big impact on differential geometry, it's like, okay, where does the math purely go from there? Well, I guess the field kind of went under like a consolidation of sorts, and like subtopics and subfields kind of like emerged and then like crystallized in and of themselves. So, you know, Riemannian geometry would then spin off things like non-Riemannian geometry, for instance, and that would become more clear, right? Things like that. But there wouldn't be so much of like climbing the ladder, so to speak, in one particular direction or in service to a particular application like general relativity. This is all relevant to what I'm saying because today what I'm reading, section 76, the connection of Levi-Civita, or the, I mean, I'm not going to read from this actually. I'm going to be reading the intro to differential geometry or Riemannian geometry stuff, because in this right here, in section 76, it doesn't say connection at all. But nowadays in Riemannian geometry, it's all about the different connections, right? Affine connection, metric connection. What is this connection relevant on Riemannian manifolds? Levi-Civita connection, so on and so forth, right? The only time the word connection was used, like in the last section, 75 that I read in the last episode, episode 35, was not even in the context of like the connection that we're talking about here. Like, so I was just like, I'm not even gonna, but what got removed, interestingly enough, from this right here, because this is, you know, Dover went back to Kreisig and they're like, hey, do you have anything that might be a banger? And he's like, I don't know, here's the Differential Geometry 1959. It went out of print. You guys can go, you know, bring that back to life. He removed, though, from going from this to the intro to differential geometry and Riemannian geometry, he removed things like talking about general relativity, basically, or like he has, like in the next section, he has these references to books like Space, Time, and Matter by Hermann Weyl. And, you know, like Weyl tensors are missing from this book. So there's a lot. Obviously, you know, this is like a 10-minute rant already, 11 minutes, 11 and a half. There's a lot to say here. I might as well just get into the reading. So, but what I was going to say with the whole obviously stuff, right? Look at this sentence. We're going to do just a quick side-by-side comparison of what was he really changing going from differential geometry. This is what's on the left, and then on the right is his rewriting in like 1969, about 10 years later. Okay, so here we go. On the left, originally he says, sorry, I'm just scrolling to make sure that you can see the webcam and everything. Obviously, this simplest displacement and the concept of parallelism resulting from it correspond to the case when the surface under consideration is a plane in which parallel coordinates, for instance Cartesian coordinates, have been introduced. So that's like, right, this guy says, obviously, this and this resulting from it correspond to the case when the this under consideration is a this, in which something, for instance, have been introduced. Like that violates a lot of the rules of good, clear, concise writing, okay? And that's kind of like why I say obviously in my canned YouTuber intros, right? Is because it's kind of ironic because he says obviously and then nothing about what he says after that is obvious at all, right? So then we have the rewriting here where we have obviously, we're just keeping that word in there. Obviously, This simplest connection and the corresponding notion of parallel vectors correspond to the case of a plane referred to a system of parallel coordinates, for example, Cartesian coordinates. Still not better. I think I counted it out before, and it's like 5 or 6 words shorter. I think the most awkward part of the rewrite here is the case of a plane referred to a system of parallel coordinates. The usage of the word referred there is, it's kind of like you're saying you're referencing the system using these parallel coordinates, like you're using the parallel coordinates to impose this referencing. And like the correct English word isn't to say maybe referenced there, but is to say referred. Anyways, that's the kind of difference left to right. But then also we have completely missing is in section 69, we mentioned the importance of these concepts in modern differential geometry and their application in the theory of relativity. No mention of theory of relativity on the right. And this is kind of like a foreshadowing here. Yeah, it's probably like section 78. By this procedure, the absolute differentiation and displacement will become independent of the metric on the surface, which is defined by the tensor G sub alpha beta. It is of interest to note that the generalized theory was developed not only for purely mathematical reasons, but also for its usefulness in solving certain problems of modern physics, as can be seen from the basic papers of Eddington. Remember the Eddington experiment? That's the whole looking at the light shift behind a solar eclipse of constellations you're expecting to be behind the apparent solar eclipse, and that those light deviations are on a magnitude which, when you're measuring them, it's an order of magnitude different than what can be calculated from just purely Newtonian formulation of how you would expect to be perceiving the light from those constellations. That is the same Eddington as this guy. Einstein, I'll come back to that in a sec. Eisenhardt, I'm pretty sure. Eisenhardt, Schouten, Veblen, those are all like non-Riemannian geometry guys, but a lot of their work was related to things in relativity. And then one of those guys, I want to say Schouten or Veblen, was for like atomic physics as well. And then I just mentioned Hermann Weyl. That's the whole space, time, and matter. And Weyl, interestingly, he was sort of like bridging the gap philosophically and in like physics more broadly after Einstein came onto the scene and was sort of like pioneering this new stuff. But none of that sentence is removed going then to the other side here in Intro to Differential and Riemannian Geometry. And I guess the last thing I'll say is, before I go into reading about Levi-Civita, is that this whole connection of Levi-Civita stuff with like parallel transport, covariant derivative, bringing in the Christoffel symbols, this all came in about 1917, which Einstein's field equations were fully baked in 1915. And then furthermore, for context, Einstein's Annus Memorabilis was 1905, which had the 4 papers. There was special relativity, the photoelectric effect, Brownian motion, one other thing which is on the tip of my tongue, but I'm forgetting right now. But so that's 1905 were those 4 papers. One of those, though, that was like special relativity. Then 10 years later, 1915, fully baked field equations. That's general relativity. But that is then all in the language of like, you know, curvature tensors and stuff like that. And we've got metrics where we've got like, you say metric in general relativity, you start seeing all this like G sub alpha beta stuff. And you're like, ooh, what's that? And it's like, ooh, first fundamental form, differential geometry. Now we're back in this land, right? And then it's like putting all the pieces together where you're like, oh, why does everything in this book, why are we using what's called the Einstein summation notation convention, right? Anyways, here we go. We are learning general relativity, differential geometry, Riemannian geometry, the right way. We're starting with the math and we're moving forward. Oh, and that's the other thing I'm going to say before I kick into this reading. Update for the channel. Basically, the merch giveaway is closed for new entries, but I'm going to announce the winners shortly. That's going to be its own episode. Yeah, that's all I'm going to say about that for now. We're just going to keep moving on. Okay, section 78. Connection of Levi-Civita. We consider vectors in a given surface, capital S, that is, vectors that are bound at points of S and lie in the corresponding tangent planes, for which refer back to section 35. I'm pretty sure that's roughly the same as what's in differential geometry, but I'm not going to look at what that is now. We want to compare the directions of such vectors which are bound at different points, say P and Q of S. It is impossible a priori. In order to make such a comparison, we must first define a rule according to which a vector in a surface can be displaced from one point of a surface to another, for example, from P to Q on S. Such a rule is called a connection. Its application yields a vector in S at Q. This vector is called the displacement of the vector in S given at P. The two vectors are said to be parallel in the sense of the connection we applied. The simplest connection is defined by the requirement that in the displacement, the components of a vector remain unchanged. That is, the displacement of the vector in S at P is the vector in S at Q, which has the same components as the given vector at P. These two vectors are said to be parallel with respect to this connection. Obviously, this simplest connection and the corresponding notion of parallel vectors correspond to the case of a plane referred to a system of parallel coordinates, for example, Cartesian coordinates. There we have that tricky usage of the word referred that I brought up in the intro. Let's get into that new stuff. A Cartesian coordinate system being given, we may introduce another Cartesian coordinate system by applying a transformation of the form given in 3.2 to 3.4, which that is the same as what's in the preliminaries chapter 1 here, which I'm going to reread. Hopefully I'll have that on the screen. We have the transformed vector x over bar sub I, where I is equal to 1, 2, or 3, is equal to the sum on the index k from 1 to 3 of coefficient a sub I k, then times the original vector x sub k, then plus the linear adjustment b sub I. And these coefficients satisfy the conditions where we have the sum on the index I from 1 to 3 of a sub ik, then times a sub il is equal to the Kronecker delta sub kl, which is equal, as we expect, it's equal to 0 when k is not equal to L, or 1 when k is equal to L. And we allow for k and L to be equal to 1, 2, or 3 here. And then we have the determinant where the columns are A11, A21, A31, and then A12, A22, and then A32, and then A13, A23, A33. This determinant is all equal to 1. So that's just to specify the conditions for these coefficients for a linear transformation from the preliminaries chapter, which is being referenced here. That's what 3.2, 3.3, and 3.4 here are. Continuing on, then vectors in the plane transform according to 4.2, which again, we have the transformed component z over bar sub I is equal to the sum on the index k from 1 to 3 of a sub I k times the original z sub k. And we have the similar conditions on the coefficients a sub I k. The coefficients a sub j k of this transformation are constant. Hence, if two vectors are parallel in the sense of that simplest connection and with respect to a given Cartesian coordinate system, they are parallel also with respect to the transformed Cartesian coordinates. Any given vector can be displaced to any point of the plane in a unique fashion. For this reason, the concept of a free vector is appropriate in elementary vector algebra and calculus. So this is just everything we already know so far. This is just elementary baby talk. Unfortunately, it is impossible to use this simplest connection on arbitrary surfaces for the following reason. If we impose an allowable coordinate transformation on an arbitrary surface S, maybe this surface has non-zero curvature, then vectors in S transform according to 30.1 or 30.2. Those are just the so-called allowable transformation laws of these, n-dimensional Riemannian spaces, basically, to keep it short here. Anyways, moving on. In this transformation, the components of the vector under consideration are multiplied by partial derivatives. Oh, and by the way, when I say allowable, it's just so that we don't have like degenerate cases where we're working with surfaces and then things degenerate to just like a line or a point, which would be namely when all of the partial derivatives after a certain point, like if we're on surfaces after 2 or 3 derivatives, let's just say, everything goes to 0. That's not allowable. So if we have anything other than that, it's an allowable coordinate transformation when we have those multiplications by the partial derivatives here, which we're talking about. So anyways, these derivatives are in general not constant, but depend on the coordinates on S because the allowable transformations of coordinates on an arbitrary surface are not linear in general. Hence, two vectors that are bound at different points of S and for which corresponding components with respect to a certain coordinate system are equal will, in general, lose this property if the coordinate system is transformed. We might be tempted to use the concept of parallel vectors in the space in which the surface S is embedded, but this would not lead to a useful result either. In fact, then the displacement of a vector in S would, in general, not be a vector in S because the tangent planes of S at 2 points P and Q are, in general, not parallel. This goes through the whole directional derivatives at any 2 different points. How do you define them? You have a whole pencil or bundle or tangent plane of all these different tangents that you could choose from. Which one's the end-all be-all directional derivative that you're going to work with that you would say is parallel to any other directional derivative at any other point on your surface? It's a very tricky thing to do a priori, right? Moreover, the notions of parallel vectors and angles on S would then depend on the embedding of S in space and would not be an intrinsic property of S. All right, what I'm looking for here is making sure that the numbers line up here. Yeah, so in this edition here, the Intro to Differential and Riemannian Geometry, section 53 here, is basically what section 57 would be in the actual, like the 2008 Dover reprinting of the 1959 edition, which is technically like the second edition of like what Kreisig wrote. Basically, there was like a first edition in German, then a second English translation, which is what this is a reprinting of, and then 68, 69, I think, is when Intro to Differential and Riemannian Geometry came out. Okay, so this right here, this Dover book, section 53 is the same at, or no, section 57 in here, in this book, is the same as section 53 over here. So what's getting talked about in the Levi-Civita section over here that is on screen now, page back, whoops, now we've overshot. And now we're going back. I'm going to read this sentence one more time. Moreover, the notions of parallel vectors and angles on S would then depend on the embedding of S in space and would not be an intrinsic property of S, for which refer back to the section on bending and isometric mapping. We have the concept of intrinsic geometry of a surface. Specifically, there's this theorem. This is what I really wanted to go back to that section for. We have in the print book that I have in my hand right here, Theorem 57.1. An allowable mapping of a portion S of a surface onto a portion S star of a surface is isometric if and only if at corresponding points of S and S star, when referred to the same coordinate systems on S and S star, gives a whole deeper meaning to that word referred. And then it's in the theorem, we're referring back to another section, section 56. The coefficients of the first fundamental forms are the same. G sub alpha beta is equal to G star sub alpha beta, and alpha and beta can be 1 or 2 respectively. That is what is being talked about here. We shall now define a connection and the corresponding notion of parallel vectors, which is suitable on any surface S and is an intrinsic property of S. In contrast to the above elementary connection in the plane, this connection will have the following very essential restriction. It will depend on the choice of an arc capital C on S, along which a vector is displaced from a point P on S to a point Q on S. However, we shall of course require that in the case of parallel coordinates in the plane, the connection to be defined will reduce to that elementary connection. Let S be any surface of class R that is greater than or equal to 3. We consider a vector A superscript J, that's a contravariant index J, in S at a point P and want to displace this vector A superscript J to a point Q on S. For this purpose, we first choose a curve capital C on S which passes through P and Q. Let lowercase s be the arc length of C. In the case of a plane, parallel vectors make the same angle with any geodesic, that is, with any straight line. This suggests the requirement that the connection on capital S to be defined should have the following property. If the curve C is a geodesic on capital S, then at every point of C, the displacement A superscript J of lowercase s of the given vector A superscript J along C should make the same angle with the unit tangent vector to C. Hence, we shall first consider the special case of a displacement along a geodesic line on capital S, which we denote by capital G. Suppose that S, capital S, is represented by the vector x in terms of coordinates u1 and u2, and capital G is represented on capital S by u superscript j equals u superscript j in terms of lowercase s, where lowercase s is the arc length. With each point of capital G, let there be associated a unit vector A superscript j of lowercase s of class R tilde, which is greater than or equal to 1, which lies in the corresponding tangent plane of capital S, but does not coincide with the unit tangent vector x sub j times u superscript j prime of capital G. Then for each lowercase s, we have g sub jk then times a superscript j then times a superscript k is equal to 1. We made the requirement that the vectors a superscript j of lowercase s should be said to be parallel with respect to capital G in the sense of the connection to be defined if they make a constant angle with the unit tangent vector of G, capital G that is. This holds if and only if the scalar product lowercase g sub jk then times a superscript j then times u superscript k prime is constant, because a superscript j of lowercase s as well as the tangent vector are unit vectors. Hence, the quantity lowercase g sub jk then times a superscript j then times u superscript k prime closed quantity prime is equal to 0. Carrying out the differentiation, we have partial lowercase g sub jk partial u superscript I then times u superscript I prime then times a superscript j then times u superscript k prime plus lowercase g sub jk then times a superscript j prime then times u superscript k prime plus lowercase g sub jk then times a superscript j then times u superscript k double prime is equal to 0. All right, I'm just going to double check what it is. I'm like, I think 39.2 here means 29.4, which is the contravariant transformation behavior. We're going to double check. Transformation property of Christoffel symbols. So I guess we have partial lowercase g sub jm partial u superscript I is equal to the scalar product of vector x sub ji with vector x sub m plus the scalar product of vector x sub j with vector x sub mi, which is equal to Christoffel sub ijm plus Christoffel sub imj. People will say gamma sub ijm, but I say Christoffel because I guess I'm just weird that way. But it's like, could be a gamma function, you know what I mean? Are these, you know, are we going to start doing PDEs here where maybe a Bessel function is going to show up, a wild Bessel boy? Who knows? We got to stay on our toes if that means calling something a Christoffel instead of a capital gamma. But anyways, after we use that, we may replace the derivative of the metric tensor finding larger outer quantity, and then we have an inner quantity Christoffel sub jik plus Christoffel sub kij, close smaller inner quantity, then we have times a superscript j then times u superscript I prime plus lowercase g sub jk then times a superscript j prime, close larger square bracket outer quantity, then times u superscript k prime plus lowercase g sub jm then times a superscript j times then u superscript m double prime equals 0. And since capital G is a geodesic, then from, I believe, the relation we're looking for here, because this is the same as, I have notes from section 76, the differential geometry book. This is another alignment issue here. I don't want to look it up right away, but 43.2 I believe is 47.4, which is the first partial derivatives of the coefficients of g sub alpha beta can be represented as a sum of two Christoffel symbols of the first kind, namely, or they're the Euler-Lagrange equations. Okay, I was totally wrong. It was actually u with a superscript k double prime plus Christoffel sub ij then superscript k then times u superscript I prime then times u superscript j prime equals 0. That is actually written differently in the book in my hand, 2008 Dover reprinting of 1959 Kreisig differential geometry. That's actually 51.5, which is, maybe I'll clip it on screen. It's u double dot superscript tau plus Christoffel sub nu sigma superscript tau then times u dot nu and then u dot sigma is equal to 0. But then we have a replacement of Greek characters with Latin characters, and we're doing primes instead of fly dots. All right, here we go. So follows from that we have lowercase g sub jm then times a superscript j then times quantity u superscript m double prime plus Christoffel sub ki superscript m then times u superscript I prime then times u superscript k prime closed quantity is equal to 0. Scoot that over, and I'm going to get some fruit cracked open here. do a quick certified, sponsored by Kroger. Just kidding, I'm not. That'd be cool though if there were like a sponsorship where I could get just like free groceries forever. Here we go. Now, Christoffel sub Kij equals lowercase g sub jm, then times Christoffel sub Ki superscript m, and a superscript j, then times Christoffel sub jik equals a superscript h, then times Christoffel sub hik, which equals, as well, a superscript h, then times lowercase g sub jk, then times Christoffel sub hi superscript j, and what was down below here, this statement, hopefully you can see, whoops, yeah, you can see that, 78.2. Now that takes the form lowercase g sub jk, then times the quantity a superscript j prime plus a superscript h, then times Christoffel sub hi superscript j, then times u superscript I prime, closed quantity, then times u superscript k prime equals 0. For the expression in parentheses of what I just read, we use the notation capital D a superscript j lowercase ds equals, or denotes rather, a superscript j prime plus a superscript h, then times Christoffel sub hi superscript j, then times u superscript I prime. We show that this vector must be the null vector. Applying covariant differentiation to 78.1, which is right here, lowercase g sub jk, then times a superscript j, a superscript k equals 1. And using theorem 75.1, might as well go back. Aha, covariant derivative of the metric tensor. The covariant derivative of the tensors g sub jk, g superscript jk, and the Kronecker delta sub j superscript k is the 0 tensor. Using that, we obtain lowercase g sub jk, then times capital D, then times a superscript j, lowercase ds, then times a superscript k is equal to 0. From this and 78.2 prime, which is above here, we see that if the vector were not the null vector, it must be orthogonal to both capital G and a superscript j, which is impossible because a superscript j is arbitrary. Hence, capital D a superscript j lowercase ds is equivalent to lowercase d a superscript j lowercase ds plus a superscript p, then times Christoffel sub pi superscript j, then times lowercase du superscript I lowercase ds is equal to 0, where j is equal to 1 or 2. To a vector a superscript j of lowercase s naught, which is given at a point of capital G, there corresponds a solution of a superscript j of lowercase s of the above 78.5 capital daj lowercase ds, representing a field of vectors in S along capital G. This field is called a displacement of a superscript j of lowercase s naught along capital G. In this fashion, we now have defined a connection which can be used for displacing given vectors along geodesics on a surface capital S. The vectors of that field are said to be parallel with respect to capital G and in the sense of this connection. It is very natural to admit in the above relation for capital D a superscript j lowercase ds, not only geodesics but also arbitrary curves capital C on the surface capital S under consideration. Then we arrive at the desired definition of a connection which can be used for displacing given vectors in a surface S along arbitrary curves on S. This connection is called the connection of Levi-Civita. The equations, as stated above, are called the differential equations of the connection of Levi-Civita. If S is of class R greater than or equal to 2, then to a curve capital C of class R tilde, which is greater than or equal to 2 on S, and a vector A superscript j of lowercase s naught in capital S, given at a point of C, there corresponds a unique solution, A superscript J of lowercase s, of the above differential equations of the connection of Levi-Civita, which represents a field of vectors in S along C. The given vector A superscript J of lowercase s naught belongs to this field. The field is called the displacement of the given vector along C. The vectors of the field are said to be parallel with respect to C and in the sense of the connection of Levi-Civita. The arc length lowercase s in the differential equations of the connection of Levi-Civita may be replaced by another allowable parameter lowercase t. This yields capital D A superscript j lowercase dt is equivalent to A dot superscript j plus A superscript p, then times Christoffel sub pi superscript j, then times u dot superscript I is equal to 0, where j is equal to 1 or 2, where dots denote derivatives with respect to t. Since A superscript j is equal to lowercase g superscript jk, then times A subscript k, and g superscript star is equal to the determinant of g superscript jk, which is non-zero, we see from the statement of the differential equations of the connection of Levi-Civita in terms of t, that the differential equations of the connection for a covariant vector are capital D A sub k lowercase dt is equivalent to A dot sub k minus A sub p times Christoffel sub ki superscript p, then times u dot superscript I equals 0, where k is equal to 1 or 2. And we're at about 58 minutes of recording, so I think I'll end it there. That's actually the longest section of basically uninterrupted text, at least from the point of view of the book. Like, here we are. This is what I just read, basically, but you know, across editions, as I've hammered on about throughout this video. But this is pages 232 and 233. You can see right here. This is the only, like, if you just opened up this math differential geometry book to a random page and you happened to open up to page 232, 233, it might look like a normal book. This is, I went through every single page of this book, trust me. This is the most normal looking page in the entire book. So yeah, I mean, there's a little bit of a recap in what I just read from like towards the beginning of the whole stuff about like developable surfaces, isometric mappings between surfaces, and we now have the connection of Levi-Civita though. So hope you guys like that. There are some problems as well, but I might read those in another video because this one's already pretty long. So see you guys in the next one. Peace.